Okay, we're back, we're live. We're here with Carlos Juarez, and he is in San Antonio, joins us by Skype. And he reminds me of Charles Kuralt, who used to do this thing for one of the big networks called On the Road, and you never knew where Charles would be reporting from. So today we are surprised and delighted to find Carlos in San Antonio, Texas. Welcome again to the show, Carlos.
Well, thank you, Jay. Nice to join you. And yes, here I am in the heart of Texas, San Antonio, a very, interesting place. I actually went to high school here way back in the 70s for a couple of years, and it was a small town back then. Today, it's a pretty dynamic city. And as we speak today a little bit about the issue of Mexicans in the U.S., Mexicans in the making of America, this is a very important place for that. And, it's a very Mexican town. But very much the cross-culture, biculture of the U.S. and this very important population of Hispanic Latinos.
Yeah, and how's the food?
Well, quite good. And traditionally, this is a region known for its Tex-Mex, more of a Texas style. But I will tell you, the large influx of immigrants from Mexico, and especially, a lot of them investing in restaurants, so more, let's say, middle and upper middle class Mexicans, they've actually brought up more higher quality refined Mexican cuisine. So you get a lot of regional cuisine, excellent food options. And other than that, it's also a big city for a lot of conferences and conventions. So it attracts a lot of tourists. And as a result, there's a lot of good places to eat. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and they have this river, river walk or something like that. It's supposed to be really beautiful.
It is quite beautiful. And, I can have memories of it back in the 70s when it was, it was nice, but it's really come a long way. I mean, some would say it's a little over-commercialized, but it's in terms of coming for a short visit as a conference goer or just to visit the famous Alamo and other sites, it's a beautiful setting right along the river walk, and they've got it well developed. Lots of bars and restaurants.
Now, before the show began, Carlos, we're talking about Donald Trump, your friend. I know he's your friend because he's not my friend. In any event, we're talking about his attacks on the Hispanics in this country. And it struck me, and I mentioned to you, and I think we agree, that it's had a reverse effect. Because while he attacks them, everybody else comes to defend them. And as a matter of fact, you get to feel, wait a minute, these are our Hispanics. They're the backbone of the country. They're very important. They're like indigenous. We love our Hispanics. So Trump attacks them, but the result is just the reverse, no?
Yes, well, it is. In fact, I would say it is a real dicey situation. I mean, very potential backfire last week in particular when he had a lot of attention focused on criticism of this judge from Indiana, or born in Indiana, I guess in California now. But, talking about his heritage being a factor. And, it raised a lot of, let's say, awkward feelings. Many of his, fellow Republicans were having to come and say, wait a minute, no, So, yeah, but, what I want to share, I've been reading a recent book that's a fascinating story about the Mexicans in the U.S. I'll hold you the cover right here. It's called Mexicans in the Making of America. It's by a historian here from Dallas, Southern Methodist University. And, it just speaks of the importance of this community of Mexicans. Now, in many ways, they have always been here, especially in the Southwest and West. They keep coming, but they are an integral part. And as some of the data makes very clear, this is an important population that is going to only get more important in the years ahead, and probably a little risky for a political leader to be alienating and angering many of them. So that's where we are today, trying to kind of come to terms with that. And what I hope today we can discuss a little bit is what is, some of the context, the background, and, how this population is reshaping politics, culture, and also just fundamental ideas about American identity. We are no longer this, perception of a white majority at all. That in many parts of the U.S., that's just not the reality.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. Let's talk about it now. What are your thoughts about it? You've been reading and thinking. So what conclusions have you been making?
Well, I think we begin, just to be informed by some basic data. I've brought a couple of slides here as well. If I can ask Zuri to show us the very first one. We have a look that, first of all, I like to say that, the Latino community, Hispanic, we have different words we might use for it. And of course, in particular, Mexicans, because they are the majority, they are obviously in the USA. They have been for a long time. Indeed, they were always here in this part of the country. And they keep coming, although curiously, that's changing. The inflow is slowing down, but the numbers that are here already are multiplying rapidly. So they're growing very fast. And just projecting some of the data that the census has told us, by the year 2050, not too far from now, nearly 1 in 3 U.S. residents will be Latino. 1 in 3 in the year 2050. And the overwhelming majority of these, of course, will be of Mexican descent. So if I could have maybe a look at the next slide, this is the book I've been referencing. It's called Mexicans in the Making of America. And it's a fascinating story that really requires us to, to be informed about this and what implications it has for both politics, policy, and more than that, culture and identity, which I think are shaping many parts of the country. As we'll see in a moment, I mean, in the past, most of them were concentrated in the West and Southwest, but today you have communities of Latinos, but including Mexicans, all over the country and in the workforce. Let me see if I can have her turn to one more, the next slide. I want to start by making a reference to an important historical moment. In the mid-19th century, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, as it was called, was signed in 1848, and this is something that every fifth grader in Mexico will learn about, but very few Americans will. Even college students have no clue. But this was a peace treaty signed between Mexico and the U.S. in a brief war of a couple of years. Of course, the U.S., the more powerful side, basically came out ahead, and the result of this was where we have the current border between the U.S. and Mexico, about 2,000 miles, signed, or not signed, it came into effect. The Rio Grande, the river that especially borders Texas and the U.S., became the official boundary, as well as many portions of the Southwest. We'll see in a moment a map. Mexico at that time would surrender a large region. If I can turn to the first map, we can see various parts of the U.S. as it expanded in the 18th and into the 19th century. But in particular, we all know, or we should know, some of the story of Texas. It had 6 flags. That's just not an amusement park. It's a part of Texas history. And one of those flags was indeed Mexico, also Spain, France. It was an independent republic, but it would be annexed into the U.S. by 1845. But shortly after, in 1848, the Mexican-American War would end with the U.S. acquiring this region known as the Mexican Cession. And this was California, Nevada, let's see, we can see Utah, part of Colorado, most of Arizona, and a part of New Mexico. A couple of years later, they would sign what's known as the Gadsden Purchase, and that would actually provide the very bottom strip, if you can see a map there. Well, this is a fact that I say because, it's part of the history and understanding. This is a region where you had large populations of Mexicans living in the area, and under this treaty, they would also have the rights of U.S. citizenship. So even today, you have many, many families of, many generations ago who've been living in these parts of the country, especially places like New Mexico and Arizona and California. These are, long established communities. Now, of course, the majority of the Mexicans in the U.S. today are more recent arrivals, and that's a result of, a steady flow of immigration. And the data there are quite significant. If I can turn to the next map, we have just a couple of factoids here. There's a map. I'm not able to see them, so I hope they're visible there to our viewers. But within the United States, we've got a little over 11 million Mexican-born residents that live here. We have along this region of the border, which is a fascinating place itself, the region that borders the north of Mexico. You've got about 20 million. And there's, you have to understand it's a very interdependent, integrated part. So the north of Mexico, people who live there cross regularly and have, more connection in many ways to the U.S. than they might to the rest of Mexico. The other is we've got within the U.S. itself a pretty sizable population of Mexicans who live here. Finally, and let me walk through just some data and then we can talk more about it to reflect on it. But I have a little information on the next slide. It's called U.S. Latino population growth. And here, what we need to see is it's been a pretty substantial growth, especially since 1965. And if we look at the year 1970, it made up about 4.5% of the population. This is the entire Latino, not just Mexicans, even though they're the vast majority. 2010, the most recent census, we have approximately 50.5 million Latinos in the U.S., about 16% of the population. Now, somewhere in around 2003, the Latinos surpassed African Americans to become the largest minority. Now, that word minority, that's in the macro population as a whole. There are many parts of the West and Southwest where they are effectively the majority. So it's a majority minority in many parts of California and Arizona, even Texas. Finally, a couple of quick points. Since the year 2000, most of the growth has been due to natural increase rather than immigration. So immigration has slowed a bit. Instead, what we have is this population that is in the U.S. is growing at a rapid rate. In 2010 alone, 1 in 4 babies born in the U.S. were born to a Latina mother. 1 in 4. That's a pretty significant chunk there. A quarter of the population born in 2010 to a Latina mother. And finally, I mentioned this earlier, by 2050, we're going to see a pretty big increase. The nation's population is projected to be nearly double the number of Latinos, from 16% today to 30%. So again, nearly 1 in 3 U.S. residents will be Latinos. And finally, I have one last chart. I just want to kind of place it in the context, because we're talking about Mexicans, and they are certainly the majority. If we have about 50 plus million Latinos in the U.S., Mexicans make up a little more than 30 million of those, or about 66%. The next group is Puerto Ricans, who are, of course, citizens of the U.S. Even Americans don't realize that. They have different rights, but they are certainly part of the U.S. It is a territory of the United States, about 4 million of them, followed by Cubans, and down the list of Salvadorans, Dominicans, etc. But by and large, Mexicans remain the largest group and will continue to be so because of their sheer numbers. And, it has important implications for, politics, policy, for culture, and so on.
Oh, I want to talk about that. We're going to take a short break, and we will talk about the implications of these data right after this short break. Carlos Juarez will be right back.
Aloha, my name is Danelia, Danelia.
And I'm the other half of the duo, John Newman. Welcome.
We are co-hosts of a show called Keys to Success, which is live on the Think Tech Live Network series, weekly on Thursdays at 11 a.m.
We're looking forward to seeing you then.
Aloha!
Hello, and I'm Patrick Bratton. Please join me for Global Connections every Thursday at 1 p.m., where we talk with a variety of guests about various international issues, historical issues, both here in Hawaii and abroad, ranging from security, human rights, ethics, and all sorts of other things. So please join me. I look forward to talking with you and seeing some of my guests.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're so happy to be able to talk to Carlos Juarez. He's the world traveler now in San Antonio, Texas. And we're talking about the implications of these data that he's been describing about Latinos, Mexicans in the U.S. and coming to the U.S. But one thing we talked about in the break, which is worth mentioning, is the recent news stories about these kids that are coming up from Honduras because their lives are threatened by gangs in Honduras and other countries south of Mexico, and what effect that has on the border and this whole process of immigration and border crossing.
Yeah, well, this is a very difficult challenge. In the last couple of years, as you noted, there's been attention to this. What we've seen is a very large number of children who literally are trekking from Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. And they are, in some ways, we have to understand these issues as what are the context, the historical and the reasons. And as you may recall, in the late 70s and into the 80s, there was a lot of conflict in Central America, civil wars, the violence in Nicaragua, which the U.S. was involved with. And as a result of those conflicts, by the mid-'80s, we've allowed many refugees to come into the U.S. We opened to bring them. Now, over time, many found themselves in our prisons, and it turned out that there are huge numbers of gangs who would be imprisoned and eventually would be released and sent back. Well, today, many of those who are people who had come to this country, and obviously we are talking about the bad ones, let's say. These are not, and they're not by any means the majority of the immigrants. This is, these are the bad apples. But I'm trying to say that because the context is back in their home countries now, they are now a source of a lot of violence. And as a result, pushing some of their young, children who have no options there but to either join these gangs or get out. Well, they come through Mexico, and that's a very, very difficult and dangerous route because they get taken advantage of in Mexico. There are traffickers. They end up in the border, and we've got, large communities of them here. So no doubt we have some very serious issues, national security, humanitarian, and that is an important issue that requires us, to address law enforcement, negotiations. Also, hoping that we can help those countries become better, because when you have violence in El Salvador, this is this is the textbook definition of globalization. What happens there affects us here.
Sure.
So we have an interest in those countries figuring out their problems and trying to support them. But we also have, I want to say, we are part of that issue. In other words, we help to, in some ways create, but it's a very troubling issue. And Mexico, of course, I mean, whether it's on the border in Central America or even up to the U.S. border, where you have a lot of, drug cartels running around, they take advantage of these young people.
So what's your thought, and for that matter, the fellow who wrote that book, what's his thought on what to do with the southern border of the United States? It's very complicated, and it's dynamic in the sense that, as you described, the percentage of Americans who are Mexican is growing, and that's a political force. It's a political force now, and by 2050, as you suggest, it'll be that much more of a political force. So there's a certain amount of political interest in changing the way the border works, in changing the way the U.S. relates to Mexico. Where do you think that's going to go?
Well, I think you got several things. And again, we tend to want to simplify it and look at it as one simple thing. We have immigrants who are coming, and maybe a small subset of those, like the ones we described, those are a small portion. What we really are speaking of is a large community of Americans who are here and have been here and are otherwise multiplying, more and more becoming citizens, and many who have been. I mean, I'm an example of that. My father came here as a young immigrant in the 1950s. I was born here in the U.S., citizenship, but I grew up here. These are my values, and I'm part of building this country, let's say. And I say that because there's a misperception to think that all Mexicans here are somehow, from Mexico. I turn to the example of this judge that Donald Trump has been ridiculing. I mean, here's a guy born in Indiana, raised there. He's a federal judge today in California. He's an American. He happens to be of Mexican heritage like me, but you put it in the right context. That may be different from a migrant worker who's coming just for seasonal work and picking agriculture goods. So we have to learn how to somehow distinguish different ones, but maybe more to the point, I think we have to understand that ultimately the immigrants who are coming from Mexico and Latin America, they're not coming so much to breathe the air of political freedom or to escape religious persecution like we have other past immigrants. They come here to work. They come here because our economy requires them, and what you have between Mexico and the U.S. is a large border with two different countries at different levels of development. The wages here in the U.S. are 10 times higher than in Mexico, so there's a natural pull. Bottom line is in Mexico, the minimum wage is about $5 a day. And in the U.S., any worker who comes here, whether legal or illegal, can usually mean gaining about $8 an hour by cutting grass, washing dishes, construction jobs, cleaning offices.
But the disparity is changing, isn't it? I mean, for example, you mentioned that the volume of immigration is actually slowing from Mexico, and that could be because Mexico's economy is not so distant, not so different from the American economy, and it's healthier all the time. And logically, you can extend that out and say, in the next 20 years, maybe Mexico will be very, very prosperous, and in that case, there won't be a need for this kind of jobs type immigration.
Well, yes, that's true on one hand, and yet our economy, it has jobs that are very few Americans want to do, picking fruit, changing beds in hospitals and construction, etc. In many ways, in the poultry factories, the meat packing plants, some pretty tough jobs that, you simply don't have enough young, let's say, non-Hispanic Americans wanting to do. Now, these are jobs, curiously, that were once filled mainly by African Americans and working class whites. So certainly there are losers in this exchange. Today, the service jobs that I've described, low wage jobs, are being done by immigrants who happen to be mostly Latino and mostly Mexican. But the losers, if you can call them that, would be those who maybe a generation or two ago used to be the ones doing this work, and they're not today. And for different reasons. The other is that the demographic shifts so that the migrant workers that are coming, or let's say immigrants who are settling, are now in all these different places, in the Midwest, in the Southeast, places where they had traditionally not settled, a generation or two ago. So it has implications for everything from public policy to school policy, education. Ultimately, and this is true of immigrants in general, I mean, when you have new people coming into your communities, it raises tensions and conflicts, and that flares up. As an educator myself, I mean, the goal is to understand the issue from its entirety, but also to help people break down barriers. And, the Hispanic Latino culture is very rich, very family oriented, obviously very well known for its food, for its music, for the arts. So rather than think of this as just a problem, we have to also see, look, there are very important contributions being made by this community, just as others.
Yeah, a great resource. And furthermore, I don't know if it's happening now. I'd like to know from you if it's happening now. But ultimately, it's a political force, and Mexicans will run for office. Mexican Americans will run for office, and they'll be sympathetic to try to resolve this on a positive basis. So, query: are they running for office? Are they a political force today in state legislators and state, executive positions in Congress, or is that not yet happening?
No, it is certainly happening, and it's gradual, incremental, but it is very real. I mean, a couple of years ago, we have the first Latina on the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor, and we've got at the level, especially at the local and state level, we do have substantial numbers of elected officials throughout, again, areas where they tend to be most concentrated, the Southwest, the West Coast, but that itself is changing. And, here I am in San Antonio, which happens to be the home of two very young and upcoming, young political leaders, the Castro brothers. They're not household names today. They certainly are here in San Antonio. One of them is a member of Congress representing the region, and the other, Julian, is currently in the Obama cabinet. He's a Health and Human Services secretary, and he has been touted as, one of the potential vice presidential candidates, not on the forefront at the moment. But no doubt that we're going to see this as a political force that can only be expected to grow. One thing that we know happens with immigrant populations in general, especially including Mexicans, once they become more Americanized, more assimilated, their interests and values become those of all others, and they're not fundamentally that different. They want good jobs, they want social issues for their families. Ultimately, I think when you see more public officials and elected officials coming from these communities, as from any community, they will begin to reflect those interests somewhat more. They'll be more sensitive to them. And for example, if you've got anybody who's an elected official from these border states, Arizona, California, they have an understanding of the populations in a way that people who don't might not. So, it is happening. It is a political force. And curiously, Donald Trump and some of his Mexican, pronunciations have probably done more to register voters and to mobilize political than anything.
So, going forward, looking into the future, when you see the numbers of Mexican Americans growing, when you see their political consciousness growing and political power growing, that's got to affect the way we handle the border and the way we handle Mexico as a border country. And I've asked you before, what about the prospect of Mexico getting a lot closer to the U.S., even becoming part somehow of the U.S.? Isn't that in the cards here? Because as you say, largely the U.S. is becoming, in percentage-wise, becoming a kind of Mexican country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is happening already. And again, if you're in a place like San Antonio, I can go here to the local shopping mall. And these are places that depend on Mexicans, actually wealthy, middle-class, upper-middle-class Mexicans who come here to shop for their goods. There has always been an economic interdependence. So we have the labor markets that, whether it's the low-skilled laborers in, agriculture, construction, some of them seasonal, some of them, permanent. But then you have a lot of connections of educated Mexicans who come here to travel, who have the ability with visas to come and go. And there's a sizable population. I mean, Mexico's a big country, 110, 120 million people. You have, many million of Mexicans who are essentially globally connected, and they are indeed some of the big investors now in the U.S. I mean, Mexico has a fair share of billionaires, and they are investing heavily in our economy. Some of it is just not widely known or understood. I mean, if you're in the finance, you'll know. Carlos Hank Slim, one of the wealthiest men in the world, has got investments in many parts of our economy, and many others like him. There is an interdependence that already exists, and especially the maybe the top quarter of Mexico, the whole border region is deeply interconnected. A lot of flow of, this is an area that also produces many manufactured goods, but there's a lot of flow of people as well that crosses those borders.
So where does it go, Carlos? Where does it go in terms of the way the border is handled and the way our relations with Mexico are handled?
Well, I don't think it goes in the form of a 20-foot concrete wall. Now, and to propose that we're going to just build the wall, I mean, it rallies up in support. It makes some people feel very jingoistic, but it's unrealistic in a world where we have this. Now, does that mean that we don't have to have borders that are controlled and obviously, rules and regulations? Of course we do. And we have real issues like, the children coming from Central America. That's a problem that we have to work to solve and manage. And ultimately, we need a process that, something that we have not been able to solve, and it'll probably be some time before we will, is we need a process to regularize the workers that do need to come, because the U.S. doesn't have enough low-skill wage workers. We need a flow of immigrants to come. It needs to be regularized in terms of some legal process for short-term workers. We've had it in the past, many decades ago. But what happens all too often in this climate we're in now is whips up this jingoism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And it kind of makes the situation seem so simple when it's quite hard to. It's a very complex issue.
Well, what about talking? What about talking between the U.S. and Mexico, between the governments, where they come to some collaborative solution? Wouldn't that be helpful?
Well, it does have to happen, and on some level it does, but there are always going to be tough issues, and partly because the issue for the U.S. is driven by its domestic politics. So political leaders have to be careful. If they sound like they're giving in too much, or they're not, sounding as if they're, addressing the border security, the national security. In this age of terrorism, you have, people who will, I'll call alarm bells to this. Oh, if we don't, seal the border, et cetera. But I think, ultimately it requires reasonable people coming together, talking, understanding the issues. Mexico and the U.S. have a very complex relationship. It's a love-hate relationship. It's very deep and it's interconnected. But similarly, in Mexico, there's also a lot of pressure on leaders to not sound like they're giving in too much.
Sure. Yeah,
so
of course.
They have to take a nationalist position as well. So this is the nature of international politics, that it's often driven by domestic politics, and it's never easy to get what you want. We all know the best outcome, but getting there is never easy.
Well, thank you, Carlos. We're out of time. It's really a wonderful experience to talk to you. Where are you going to be next? We're going to catch you again soon.
Yeah, I think back in Mexico City. I'll reconnect very shortly and give an update from developments there. There's always something happening there. And again, for Americans, we need to be aware of what's happening in this important neighbor to the south. So I'll reconnect sometime soon from down under.
Global Connections with Carlos Juarez, otherwise known as Charles Kuralt. Thank you so much, Carlos. Aloha.
Aloha.